didn't tell her about my fight.
I did.
Yeah, you don't want that to get around. Everybody wants you to know.
I don't like how you.
I've heard a lot of you.
They're making us hot tea from here, but at the other end, if you want to find something it's just all.
Well, I was watching you. Just make sure you didn't cause any.
Is Lynn here? Jenny?
That was a long time ago.
She just said something.
This is my fiance, Eric. I hope he's a fan.
That was made by Dorothy Fox, is that right?
Right.
Yeah. And it was a gift. She made, how many of them? 11 of them for people.
For 160 You don't like it? No.
I've never met him.
Excuse me, are you guarded?
Yeah.
That's the way it does with me, and I wonder which one.
The 50 and up members receive, that were active, receive one.
So while we're waiting to start, feel free to take a look at the quilt. The pictures you might recognize a lot of people.
Thanks.
Yeah, you say that. She said, well, it's their fault. She sure did. She said,
Right, it's just right on
You guys can't stand to sit behind me.
Any more chairs?
Ann grew up here, went to high school, etc. here. She has a very long resume. She was in Illinois College in Jacksonville. I can't begin to read it all to you. She's been married to Richard for 48 years. Pretty good. That's quite an accomplishment. Any of us that have gotten past 40, we're all like, oh wow, we did it. She went to National Lewis University, got an MA there. She's been an elementary school teacher in several states. List of states here, including Texas, Illinois, etc. She's has been the educational director of the Rockford Area Arts Council up in Rockford, among many other things listed here. She has 4 children, 10 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. And I would never think these guys look so young. I would never guess they had great-grandchildren. She's been a member of the Baha'i Faith since 1968, and currently she's in the faculty and part of the National Lewis University. So let's give them a very loving, warm welcome.
Well, I certainly want to make certain everyone knows who my sister is, and she keeps telling me she's not going to say anything, but you know, about the first time I say something she doesn't agree with, she'll probably, we'll hear from her, and the rest of you too. I mean, some of you have been here a lot longer than I have, so please feel free to interrupt and share, because I don't always get things right. My husband tells me that I don't always get everything right. But I do want to start by thanking the library for really honoring my mother. I mean, it meant so much to her before she moved on to the next world, and we're so grateful that we'll be able to continue to talk about her, and you know, people will remember Opal Lee stories forever, I'll bet. And I also want to thank the Baha'i community for doing this, because without you coming to me and saying, let's do this, we wouldn't be here today. Now, I have to say that when I came home from Alaska and had become a Baha'i, I can't say my mom was really excited about that. But I can tell you that after many years of being around the Baha'is, who are wonderful, loving people, they really won her over. And she was real comfortable going to Baha'i events with us. And, you know, I grew up going to the Chatham Methodist Church, and many of you I recognize from when I was in Sunday school. And, I certainly learned a lot of who I am and who I became at that point. In fact, one of the stories that I often tell is, you know, a lot of you may know that we've adopted 4 children that are part black and part white. So how did I come out of Chatham, Illinois, which was primarily white? I don't think there was, when I grew up, a single person of color that lived here. How did I grow up and believe so strongly in the oneness of humanity? And then I ran into the Baha'is who really believed that. And I can really trace that back to a little song that I sang in Sunday school. Some of you will remember, I'm sure, red, yellow, black, and white, all are equal in God's sight. And, you know, I sang that song, and it was engraved on my heart, and I believed it. You know, sometimes I wonder if the people that were teaching that to me really knew what that meant, because had you know, not very much experience with people of color. But I believed it, and then had to go ahead and carry that out and live it. I believe in walking your talk, much like my mother walked her talk. There's no question about whether Mom did what she believed. In fact, I just noticed in there a play that she was in high school. Was called Spitfire Woman, maybe? Lady Spitfire. Is that not a perfect name for my mother? Some of you may remember when she died, one of the things she collected was skunks. And we looked at this skunk collection and said, "Do you want it? No. Do you want it?" You know, who wanted a skunk collection? And so we said, well, let's just pass those out at her funeral. And I can't tell you, you know, we let people, everybody that came through picked a skunk out. And I can't tell you how many people tell me that they still have that skunk, and when they see that, they remember my mother. And like he said, Baha'is really believe in saying prayers for people in the next world, and that's really important. And so I'm very grateful for anybody here that every time they see that skunk, they'll say a little prayer for my mother. That would be great. I'm planning just to kind of tell stories. You know, history really is told from the perspective of the person that has written it. When I look at the history books, most of our history books are written from the perspective of white men, frankly. You know, Native American perspective isn't in the history books. Women's perspective isn't really written into our history books. And when I read things that my mother wrote, I know that she was telling Chatham history from her perspective. And I think it's really important that we hear stories from women's perspective, frankly. But that doesn't mean that this is the only thing that happened. You all might have a totally different perspective of the same event that happened than my mother did. And then I've read about it, and then I'm going to talk about it, and it's my perspective. So there's no way really to talk about history without it becoming really personal, I think. But then as a school teacher and as a principal, I think we teach children history from mostly one perspective. And I think it's really important for all of us to encourage our children to study the past from many different perspectives, not just one. So don't just because it's on the internet doesn't make it true. Just because it's in the history book doesn't make it true. Another Baha'i principle is independent investigation of the truth. And so I want to just encourage everybody to, anytime you're trying to learn about something, to look at things from multiple perspectives. And then you decide what you think is really true, from your perspective, of course. But so I want to tell stories, and then as I was preparing for this, I really got into some of the Chatham history that I found really important. My mother was born in 1920, which was the year women won the right to vote. There has been so much change that happened in her lifetime. She lived for 87 years. When she was born, there wasn't even electricity. Flush toilets. Her life, let alone television and the internet, and just think of the change that happened just in my mother's lifetime. And some of you sitting around the table, this is true for you as well. One story I'd like to talk about is my sister. Now, just before my sister was born, she was born in 1948. I was born in 44. So I was 4 when she was born. Both of my grandfathers and my father built our house, which your son lives in. Yeah. Isn't that your son? Your son? Your son. Your son. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. I'm trying to, I see all these familiar faces, and I'm just really trying to remember exactly who fits with who here. I remember my grandfather's team of horses dragging dirt out of the ground for the basement in that house. That's how far, can you imagine that happening today? That's how far really we have come. And they didn't go to the lumber yard and buy a lot of new lumber. They didn't get a prefab house hauled in and it was up in a day. They tore down an old barn to get wood to build that house. And they did it themselves. I just imagine what kind of labor-intensive work that was. But I remember when Mom was pregnant with Linda, we were walking down to where Dad was working on the house, and we crossed the street. Do they still oil the streets here in Chatham? Yeah. Well, they had just oiled the streets, and so Mom, I was 4, and she was carrying me across the street, and she slipped and fell. And so we were covered in oil. And so she then took me into Karen Martin's house, which was where my cousin lived. One of the Baha'is actually lives in the house that, for some reason I remember Mom calling that the Horner house. Does that make sense to anybody? Is that right?
Bertha Horner owned house on the corner, yeah.
Okay. And who was Bertha Horner?
Well, to my knowledge, this is really going back, but I think she really was from, I thought around Glenarm or somewhere over there, but she owned that house, and I don't know who lives there now, but yeah.
Karen Martin lives there.
Her daughter and granddaughter, her daughter-in-law and granddaughter are here from Haifa, Israel, so she excused herself early.
Oh, okay.
Otherwise, we actually stopped by and she gave us a tour of the house a little earlier today because my cousins had lived in that house and I really wanted to see. And I remembered stories like the falling in the oil, and my mom carried me into that house and put me, there were laundry tubs on the back porch, and she set me in the laundry tub to get me all washed off with all the oil that was there. So it's always been interesting to me what we remember. There are so many things that happen in all of our lives. So why do I remember that moment?
It was tragic at the time.
Well, it was connected to my emotions, I think, is what research will tell us, is if something is really connected to your emotions, you'll remember it. I remember being pulled around Chatham in a little red wagon with Linda and I. And there's one particular moment that I remember. I have no idea why I remember that moment, but I know we got pulled around Chatham a lot in a red wagon. So at the age of 6, my sister ended up in a children's hospital because she had TB in her spine, and so she was in a full body cast. For 2 years she was in this hospital. Now imagine this today. My parents could visit her 2 hours every Sunday. They weren't allowed to visit her any other time. The minister at the church, who was Glenn Sims at the time, was allowed to go in anytime. So he would go visit Linda and report back to my parents. But I was allowed to go in to visit her on Christmas Day. Now, would parents allow that today? I mean, but it was just, it's what you were told, and you didn't really question authority. Where I think today, we really question a lot more and think there's something wrong with that. I cannot imagine if any of my children had been in a hospital. I mean, anytime they were in the hospital, I was there 24 hours a day. I didn't leave. And yet my parents weren't allowed to visit her only 2 hours a week. So times really have changed.
But you stop and remember that was considered a contagious disease too.
But mine wasn't.
Did they know it? Because I remember we used to go and stand outside.
The reasoning for them doing that is I think the state of Illinois paid for the hospital care, but they wouldn't have paid for care at home. And I had to have all this care, and it was going to be extremely expensive. So that was the only way I was going to get it.
Her roommate certainly didn't have a contagious disease. She had cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
And this is very interesting to me as well. Her roommate her name was Kathy Zameskel, and her parents lived in Ohio, and so they couldn't even come on Sundays. And so my parents would always include her roommate in their visit on Sunday. Kathy Zameskel was from a Baha'i family. Isn't that just such a coincidence? In fact, I've always believed that the reason I was able to recognize Baha'u'llah, who's the prophet of the Baha'i faith, and we believe really is the return of Christ, I believe because of the kindness my family showed to this Baha'i child was really, so I've always told my mom it was her fault that I became a Baha'i. So not only did she teach me,
Yeah, there was a one-room schoolhouse kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
yeah, but your teachers were the nuns, weren't they?
It was kind of a poor education, but it was better than that.
Yeah. We discovered when she got home that she hadn't quite been prepared for what she was going to be facing. So not only did my mother cause me to become a Baha'i because of that, all the Baha'i principles that she taught me in her life, really, like, believing in the oneness of humanity, really prepared me for that, I believe. My mother, just as many of you know, had great respect for the past. She always talked about her roots being in Chatham. I mean, we knew that there was no way she would leave Chatham. Although, interestingly enough, I was born in Madison, Wisconsin. But it was because my father was in the Army, and it was the only time she was gone from Chatham, just maybe 2 years there when I happened to be born. So I wasn't born in Chatham, but I certainly grew up here and still call this home. In fact, thank you. In fact, Dick, I'd say, well, let's go home. And that, of course, meant Chatham. And one day he said, "What? Isn't our home your home?" Yeah, but Chatham just feels like home still to me. And although after we sold Mom's house, then we really didn't have any place to stay in Chatham. and I think I said to Linda one time, I just sort of feel a little disconnected now, because I go to Chatham and Mom's not there, and there's definitely something missing, that's for sure. But one of the things Mom did was she spent lots of time here at this library, and she would order microfiche and get newspaper articles from the past, and I'm sure you could speak more to this than I can, but she would read those newspaper articles, and then she would pull out of those newspaper articles, again, things that were important to her. And this is how history is created, really. We look at original documents, and then somebody, in this case it was my mom, was pulling out things that were important to her, and from a woman's perspective in this case, which is important.
And if she found something that pertained to you, as she did for us, the big building up on the corner of the square that we've owned, well, since Larry was 19, he's now 76, so we've owned it for a long time. But anyway, she found the newspaper article when the lumber was being brought in, and it was for that building.
And so then she shared that with you.
So I have it. Yeah,
wow.
Of course, I would keep it.
Yeah. And many people would bring things to her because she got to be known as the Chatham historian, and so they would bring articles to her, and then she would share them with people too. That I think she. So I really didn't know that she did that.
But her articles went way back to the Sangamon Messenger, which was published in the late 1800s.
Right.
So
right.
She took them from the Journal and the Register before they became the State Journal Register. But the Sangamon Messenger was way before that.
Uh-huh.
And she went year by year by year by year through these microfiche rolls. She spent hours and hours and hours in front of the microfilm reader.
Yeah, yeah. And then she wrote a lot of articles for the Chatham Clarion called I Remember. Some of you may remember reading those. And Linda had copies of all of those that she
There's
sent
one
to
up on the quilt, I remember.
Oh, is there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Neat. Here's one of the things she said in one of her articles. She said, Chatham has been my home for over 70 years. It's very disheartening for me to see old Chatham ignored. Chatham would not be the place where people seemed to want to move. I mean, she saw people wanting to come to Chatham, wanting to live here, if it hadn't been for those who had gone before. So she just really had respect for the past, and really, you all know, she was an advocate for old Chatham, and she didn't have much tolerance for new Chatham.
She went to the board meetings.
Yeah, she did.
Never miss.
Yeah, somebody here just said to me a little while ago, I wish your mom was still going to those meetings. She'd sit in the front,
Taking shorthand.
Challenge
Yeah.
everything.
raise her hand. And I have to say, if I had lived here in Chatham, Mom and I didn't always agree about things. We had lots of interesting discussions about things that were going on, and it was probably a good thing I didn't live here, because we might have not but we could always talk about things. It was okay if we didn't agree. There was only one thing that we could not talk about. Anybody have any idea what that was?
Politics. No?
No.
No?
We didn't always agree, but we could talk about it. The Redskins.
Oh.
The Glenwood Redskins.
They should have still been here.
Well, my husband and I have been real involved with Native American culture. We have a sweat lodge in our backyard. We spend a lot of time at Lac du Flambeau and an Indian reservation, and so we really understand the perspective of the Native Americans. Some Native Americans, not all. I mean, all Native Americans don't agree. But Mom and she knew what I thought. We could not talk about it. It was not even,
She even went to Lac du Flambeau with us.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She spent time up there with us and knew a lot of Native American people. But, for her, it was honoring the Native Americans. And so I said to her one day, well, how do you think people would feel if somebody portrayed the Pope on a basketball court? Would they feel like that was respecting the Pope? And, she had to say, oh, that wouldn't be right. Well, when somebody dresses up like a Native American chief, that's really the same thing to Native Americans. It from my perspective, was not being respectful. From hers, it was. So, but we couldn't talk about it. we just agreed to disagree. And does anybody know what the original name of Chatham was?
Caldwell. Caldwell?
Nope. Not, at least not.
No, they wanted to name it, but they
didn't. Okay. Goosetown.
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 really.
Yeah.
I've never heard that.
It was written down, so it must be true. Goosetown. From an article that Luella Laswell wrote in 1936, she said, 100 years ago, which would have been 1836, a country in and around Chatham was the country around Chatham was a great prairie upon which a few scattered settlers had built simple little homes and started cultivating the fertile soil. Because the distance to Springfield, their nearest trading place, was so great. Now, Chatham to Springfield doesn't seem like a great distance now, does it? But if you didn't have a car, if you had to ride a horse to get in there, the distance was a lot greater, I'm sure. So a few men met together and discussed the need of a nearer trading place. It was then that the village of Chatham was planned. So then I also had I wanted to know more about this trading. I mean, because that seemed to be the driving force for getting Chatham started. So in a document from my father's history side of the family, let me read you this. It said, wait, is that the part I wanted to read? No, that's not it. Oh, here it is. Maintaining a large household in Illinois 100 years ago was a problem. We who have to go to the grocery store every week to buy provisions certainly would be at a loss in 1837. So this was right, this story is actually from down around St. Louis, but this was really, I feel like, what was going on in Chatham too. On the farm, all the meats and grain for the flowers, potatoes, and vegetables were raised. There was never a very large supply of sugar on hand, and that was saved just for company. Twice a year, James Lee, who's a relative on my father's side of the family, went to market in St. Louis. And I think his family was from the Albany area, so they were traveling from Albany area over to St. Louis to the market. Such a trip that must have been, driving in a big wagon all the way to St. Louis. In November, he loaded the wagon with dressed poultry, honey, and all kinds of fresh products. In St. Louis, he drove the wagon into the open market, and people came from the city and bought from the wagon. Then, with the money, he bought coffee, tea, salt, and corn molasses, things that they couldn't grow. After he had bought his own provisions, he loaded his wagon with all the salt he could haul back for the store. With the salt, he got credit for those things he had to buy in the store. So that was kind of the way the market worked. And so that seems to me, from what I've read, really why Chatham got started was the marketplace was so far away that they decided to create their own little town. So the village was laid out and platted, and it was registered October 22nd, 1836 by Luther Ransom. Does anybody know anything about Luther Ransom here?
He's mentioned several times. I've got the history of the Chatham Presbyterian Church, which was actually founded the year before Chatham, so in 1835, and he was instrumental and I think probably quite wealthy. They came from Potsdam, New York, and I think he bought a lot of land around here.
Well, he constructed, it looks like he did have some wealth because he constructed the first house in the village on the site now occupied or close to where the community building is. So does anybody remember a log house up there? I don't, but it sounds like there was one. In 1837, so right after Chatham got started, the need for a school became necessary, and as there was no building available, classes were held in a smokehouse at the home of Luther Ransom. So that's your first school.
And everybody had a craving for ham.
Yeah, right. That was the first school lunch, maybe. The following years, 1838, a one-room frame schoolhouse was erected and used for educational purposes for 19 years. It was replaced in 1858 by a two-story frame schoolhouse costing, you won't believe this, $2,400. This school, I mean, you couldn't even build a sidewalk to a school for that. This school included 3 classrooms, halls, and cloakrooms. Remember the old cloakrooms? Yeah. Now you just have lockers or hooks in the hall, But we had cloakrooms at the old Caldwell School. I certainly remember that. So other institutions over the next 43 years started coming in to Chatham. The first post office was 1838, so it was, the first election wasn't held until 1861. Now, we already had a democracy, people were voting. How did people vote? Where did people vote if they didn't have a city to vote in, I wonder? Anybody know? So maybe they just didn't vote, huh?
Was that a time when only landowners could vote?
I don't know. Do you think so?
A national election and an election for local officials.
I don't know.
That's more the truth and not.
That's what
Yeah,
I wonder,
yeah,
if the election sheet that history referring to would be a local, election for local people in the town, possibly.
So, who? Yeah, well, that's, yeah. And hopefully somebody will go research this and figure out how did the first president get elected? Who voted? Was it just the congressman? I mean, did we have a system for people all across the country to vote back in the 1800s?
I'm a historian. Megan, do you know anything about the voting records? No.
Anyway, that was certainly a question that came to my mind as I was looking at this, and didn't have time to really investigate any further. Anybody know which was the first church in Chatham? You said the Presbyterian Church was in 1835.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't, maybe, I don't think it was that building, but it was established in 1835, which is a year before Chatham. There might have been a Baptist way back then, too.
Right. My information said that the Baptist church was the first church in Chatham.
My mom and her family always said they had gone to the Baptist church, so I assume that was before the Presbyterians.
But when I was growing up, there wasn't a Baptist church here. There was a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church, a Lutheran church, and a Catholic church when I was growing up. When did the Baha'is first come to Chatham? No, because I wasn't a Baha'i when I lived here in Chatham.
I think they were the Persian friends.
Okay. In fact, that was kind of a funny story too. Yeah. When I came home from Alaska, having become a Baha'i, my grandmother took me aside, Grandma Young. A lot of you know Grandma Young. Took me aside and she said, "Ann, you get rid of your Eskimo religion." I said, well, it's really not an Eskimo religion. And then she said, Chatham's just not the way it used to be. She said, there are foreigners that live here now. And as I learned who the foreigners were, they were Persian Baha'is.
During the height of the persecution, and America welcomed the Iranian Baha'is.
Right.
And since that point, of course, we all have learned a whole lot about the Middle East and persecution and how people that don't think the same as the mullahs are treated. And the Baha'is still to this day are really persecuted. And for example, Baha'i women are put into prison because they haven't had a Muslim wedding ceremony. And they can't have a Muslim wedding ceremony because they're Baha'is. They've certainly had a wedding ceremony, but they're called prostitutes because they haven't had, and so they'll throw them into prison because of that. So many of the Iranian Baha'is have left Iran and have gone to other countries, and a family came to Chatham, Illinois. So I think that must have been like in the late 60s when the Baha'is first came to Chatham. The first doctor came to Chatham in 1837, but there was so little need for a doctor that he had to get another job.
A veterinarian?
No, in fact, he finally moved to Tremont, which is by Peoria, isn't it? Yeah, yeah, so he left here and went to Tremont. I guess they were sicker there or something, I don't know. In 1881, there were 3 general merchandise store, 1 drugstore, a bank, a restaurant, a hotel. There's not a hotel now, is there? No. A lumberyard, a meat shop, 2 shoemakers, 2 blacksmiths, 4 carpenters, 1 grain dealer, and a mill. So those were the businesses that were here in Chatham. And it said 3 general merchandise stores. It didn't say grocery store. Did most people just grow their own groceries mostly? And then other things, they bought at a merchant, yard goods, fabric.
Yeah,
Yeah, that have yard
the early Dollar General, yeah.
and sewing and various things like that.
But it doesn't say,
Gory grocery store
Yeah.
when I was 4 years old, which was that in 38.
in 38. So by then, I mean, I grew up, certainly there, I remember the grocery store, but
This
it's,
is more of a general store, because they sold everything, I think.
Well, we could get produce and meat there, and bread.
Yeah.
well, the meat shop or the butcher shop, we called it, was right across from Grandma Young's house. Corey's meat we called it the butcher shop. So you'd go there to get meat, but I think you could have get other things there too, couldn't you? Yeah. Yeah. By 1935, the coming of the hard road. How many people here know what the hard road is here in Chatham?
My dad helped lay the bricks.
Really? Yeah. Yeah. But a lot of people, don't know when I mention. In fact, recently I was having a discussion with somebody and I said something about, oh, that was on the hard road. And they said, what? The hard road. So apparently that was opposed to a dirt road, probably? The hard road. Yeah. Yeah. So the coming of the hard road through the village was a great help. And then right about that time was when we got unlimited use of electricity that was made possible by the Illinois Terminal Railroad System. So apparently the railroad needed electricity, and so it got brought into Chatham.
Yeah, those little, in urbans,
Uh-huh.
they ran on the electric line, yeah.
Actually, the railroad supplied the electricity to Chatham because Urban was an electrically powered railroad.
Uh-huh.
And they made a bargain, I guess you would say, with the village board. In fact, we have a copy of that for the Railroad Museum here, where they made an agreement with the railroad that they would allow the railroad to build their tracks, came up what would be now South Main Street, came up along the square to Walnut, made a sharp right turn, and then over to parallel the railroad tracks here now. But they made an agreement in 1904 that if the railroad would supply electricity for lights around the village square, then they could build their tracks through the town.
Oh.
Mr. Master, historian for the railroad.
Railroad, yes. Oh.
And the first railroad in Chatham was in 1852, which is the alignment that's currently still here.
Okay.
So the first one.
1852 was the first railroad through
Right.
Chatham. Interesting. I didn't know that.
Chicago and Mississippi were.
Uh-huh. Cool. In 1935, Chatham also got water. So, I grew up seeing these pumps in my grandparents' yards that were the wells where you pump the water, but we didn't hardly ever use them, and that's because we had gotten water into the houses, wasn't it? But that was still a water supply if you needed something for outside or something. We used it once in a while. Uh-huh, yeah, yeah. What about sewers? When did Chatham first get indoor toilets?
Really during your time.
That wasn't too long ago, we got sewers. Because
Well, I guess it's indoor toilets, but we had septic systems.
Yeah.
Those
And,
2000s.
I think the sewers, because we got tons and tons, loads of dirt at our place to fill in low areas from the sewers, and I want to say it was early 60s maybe.
I think you're right.
You mean 1860 or early?
1960.
Okay, I was gonna say, whoa, I didn't know we were so.
The sanitary district.
Yes, the infrastructure was beginning to, as Ann is
Close
alluding
to the time
to,
we
be
got
built,
that.
so that more and more people could come in.
It was in the 60s sometime because we hadn't built our house yet out here when we were getting all that dirt. Larry would know exactly.
On a septic. What about outhouses? When did we stop using outhouses? Because I can remember at the Chatham Methodist Church having to use the outhouse.
Our family still had the outhouse. I was probably freshman or sophomore in high school. And so that would have been about 57. We still had outhouses around, and it's whenever your family could afford to put an inside plumbing in.
so it had to be the late 70s at least.
Wasn't that about the time we got gas? Natural gas?
Now, these are all things that my mother saw change in her lifetime. I mean, how...
The whole Industrial Revolution.
Right, yeah. Right. I mean, it's just amazing the change that happened really in my mother's lifetime.
And as indication of mother's strength and power, she was able to stay up with it. You know, she was able to keep up with all these changes in spite of the fact she didn't like them. They knew Chatham, no, thank you, but she kept up with the changes.
Right. She did. She sometimes went kicking and screaming.
Yes.
as a lot of you know, I mean, she was real involved in the community building. And when my father died, my grandfather had been part of the leadership that built the community building. When my father died, he was on the board of the community building, and my mother went and said, "Can I take over his?"
Very good. See, another indication. She didn't wait to be asked.
Oh no.
Like most women, wait to be asked because it's too forward to, assume that you can run or do anything.
Right. Yeah.
So even that.
No, she offered and she did it, she said, because they needed a woman's perspective. Right? My mother and father both graduated from high school in 1938, and there were 10 people in their graduating class. Mom immediately went to secretarial school, and my father decided to hop a freight train to Arizona, visit his brother in Phoenix. It cost him, he spent $2.73 to get out to Phoenix. Yep, I thought that was sort of an interesting story for food. Yeah. Another story I remember him telling was one time he was hopping freight trains and he got stopped by the police and put into jail in Texas. And so the next morning they sent them out kind of on a chain gang kind of to work, and he just walked away. So he was an escaped convict. My mother was elected to the, one of the things I remember when I was a little girl is she was elected to the village board. She was a village, so she did run for office. And she served just one term because it was back when you could smoke in the meetings, and she'd come home smelling like smoke, and my dad didn't like that, and so she didn't run again. But she never quit. She was she was always interested in local politics, as you all know, and she would go to the school board meetings. She would go to the city meetings. She was on the community building board. She was just constantly involved in their community. And she, back when she was on the village board, she said there were so many people attending board meetings that they'd have to stand outside. I think they must have met in that little building, the utility building now, I think. And it was small, and so there wasn't room for many people in there, but people would stand outside and look in the windows and let their voice be heard, you know. So she was really frustrated later on when people just weren't involved in the community. That was really important to her, to go to those meetings and be informed. And I think politicians figured out that a lot of her friends would come to her and say, what do you think? Who should we vote for? And so more than several times when I was at her house, the politicians would be knocking on her door, you know, trying to get her support. And of course, she was not shy about letting them know what she thought. And, you know, it often wasn't in their favor, but she was really out there. She was not afraid to really investigate the truth, which is another Baha'i principle, and speak up and let her voice be heard. Let's see. Some of those things I've already mentioned. The Chatham Fair Stand. I can't talk about Chatham without talking about the Chatham Fair Stand. That really, for, was it 17 years maybe, that the Chatham Methodist Church had a food stand at the state fair. And my parents both were just really involved in working. They would, the food was all cooked at the church, and they had barbecue and beef noodles and homemade pies, and people from the entire fairgrounds would just flock to that food stand because it was home.
Stand behind somebody
Right.
waiting to get a seat.
Right, because it was good home-cooked food, you know. The men of the church made the noodles. Yeah, right? Yeah. Yeah, yep. So it was really a wonderfully team building. I mean, there was such, it really was, it just unified. And there were people that helped with the state fair that didn't even go to the Methodist church. You know, I always felt like it was a community effort almost, because people just would take their vacations to do that. Sports, Mom and Dad loved to go to basketball games and baseball games. Dad often was the scorekeeper. And they even named an award at the high school after them for the best supporting. I don't know if they still have that award, but. Oh, is that right? Oh, yeah. They would start watching the kids play basketball in elementary school and follow those kids. And they would be telling me about kids I didn't know anything about, you know, but it was like they were their kids, you know. I always thought maybe my father was just frustrated that he didn't have a son. He had 2 daughters, and that was before girls could play in sports much. I mean, I think he started a baseball team for you, maybe, but the only thing I could be was a cheerleader. I couldn't, there was nothing for me. But Yep, yep, yep. But
So that's how we want.
right. But they just had that personal connection that kids need so much today. They cared. I mean, it wasn't fake. I mean, they would get to know the kids when they were in elementary school, and they would follow them for years and talk about them to us. Mom, somebody, when I was in the bathroom, I heard them talking about Mom going to the school. They had a special grandparent. Okay, yeah, and you said that was your class. Any stories you want to share?
Well, not really. It was the student was paired with a grandparent, and they would converse, writing back and forth. And then in February, we always had a meal for them and a program, and they would come to school. And she would follow those kids for years and years.
That's right. I mean, she did. It wasn't just a one-year thing. I mean, they became her kids. I mean, they at her funeral, there were 2 of those students that spoke. And her organ, actually, we gave to one of the students who played the organ at her funeral. So that was really a special thing, and such an example, I think, for everyone. We all need to be supporting the children and the youth in our communities. You know, we've got to get away from those computers and TVs and cell phones and get back to, I think, the basics. I think, you know, when I was growing up, the world view was really small. I didn't know about the Middle East. I didn't know much about, I mean, our life was Chatham, Illinois, really, and maybe Springfield. St. Louis, we'd go once a year or something, you know. It was just really small.
You talking about your parents and supporting sports so strongly made me think, gee, I wonder if they inspired this community, leading to what was in this week's Chatham Clarion, that Plymouth High School is picked best in the United States for sports.
Ranked
Really?
Ranked,
number
really?
in the,
ranked number 1
in the United States.
Oh, that gives me goosebumps.
Yes, thank you, Opal and
Wow.
Mr. Lee.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, nothing like that happens just by 1 or 2 people, but
Right, but
absolutely.
you know, the inspiration or the model for it or something.
Right. Right.
I'm just speculating. That makes a person
Yeah.
wonder.
And
Right.
they have
Again,
a
I
Hall
think
of
you're
Fame
Yeah,
now.
yeah, you bet. There's been so many changes in the world, and you have to ask why there have been so many changes in the last, 200 years. Not only in Chatham, but in the whole world. The Baha'i perspective is that every time a new prophet from God, like Jesus or Moses or Buddha or Zoroaster or Muhammad, Baha'u'llah, appear on the earth, there's new creative energy that's infused into every atom in the universe for people to tap onto, to come up with those creative ideas, to invent those new things, And my perspective would be that that's really the impetus behind all of this change that has happened in the world. The problem is we invent these things, but we don't know how to use them properly. And what never changes is the need for those virtues that you find in every single religion: honesty, patience, respect, love, peace, patience, all of those virtues throughout all the religions throughout centuries. Though the need for those virtues in our lives never changes. And I think that's one of the things that my mother and my parents really brought to the table. They live those examples, you know, they live those virtues and just really set it, you know, a wonderful example for all of us. And I know many people in this room have done the same things. You know, I think my mom just wasn't shy about getting out there and talking about it, letting people know what she thought. So I guess I'd just like to close by saying, just encouraging all of us to encourage our children to become involved in the community and to live those virtues that, you know, without those living our life based on those principles, the world is going to be a world of hurt. It's going to be a lot, and I think we see that in our world today, don't we? We see lots of the institutions crumbling. You know, our schools struggle, our government struggles, our churches struggle. You know, we've got to all get back to those basics. We have to move along with the future, with all the technology and all the new wonderful inventions and the things that happen. We can't stay stuck in the past. In fact, one time I was talking to an older gentleman, and he was kind of reminiscing about the past, and I said, "Oh, you really wish you still lived back there?" And he said, "Are you crazy? I don't want to use an outhouse." You know, we have to move forward with all of that, but we have to hang on to those things that should never change. So, thank you very much. So, questions and thoughts?
Well, as you were talking about the changes your mother saw and, you know, changes and everything, I remember one thing that she told me one time, and I told a lot of visitors to the Railroad Museum here. She said when she was a young lady just out of high school, she worked in downtown Springfield, and she had an hour for lunch, and she'd get off for lunch and she'd hustle to the interurban station, catch the southbound train, come to Chatham, run home, grab a couple of sandwiches, run back to the station, catch the northbound train, and she said, "I was never late for work."
Really? I didn't know that.
I didn't know that. Was very interesting because, you know, as it changes, there's no way today you could do that.
Right,
In our
right.
modern world, there's no way you could go from downtown Springfield to Chatham, eat lunch, and get back
In time
in an
for,
hour.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And her first job was working for Franklin Life Insurance,
Okay.
and her first boss was Lochner, Aiden Lochner.
I could bring that up because he and his wife were really, really sweet people.
Oh.
And he was my husband's boss until
Is
he
that right?
retired.
Is that right? I didn't know that. Huh.
Aiden and Mary Lou Lochner. Aiden is still
With us.
with us.
Is he?
Very alert, very strong.
Probably thinking about Aiden Senior.
Yeah, that's who we're talking about.
Oh, this is Aiden Junior.
Oh.
We know Aiden Jr.
Working along.
Time. Yeah.
And I'm working with the history group that we're starting here at the Chatham Library. And if it hadn't been for your mother and all the stuff that we have, we would have lost so much.
Right.
I'm serious about that
Yeah.
because she, you know, a lot of people probably looked at her as a little eccentric, saying all
think?
these old newspaper articles and this, that, and the other thing. But if it hadn't been for someone like that,
Yeah.
we would have lost so much of our history. And that's our roots. That's where we came from.
That's
you know?
right.
And like you were talking about the love and the hope and those kind of virtues in that. It takes a person like your mother to help us all understand that. So
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you to you and to Linda for being here today.
Yeah.